Joining me now to talk about this call for sweeping reforms is CNN's senior Vatican analyst, John Allen, a regular guest on this show. John, what do you make of this manifesto?
Well, first of all, Becky, as an American, I want to thank you for making Thanksgiving happen early for me this year, because I am always grateful for the chance to share virtual space with you, and so I'm thankful for that chance. Listen, in a piece I wrote for my newspaper today called The National Catholic Reporter, I actually referred to this as Francis's "I Have a Dream" speech, because he begins this document with a dream. He says his dream is of a more missionary church, that is, the church that reaches out to people rather than collapsing in and on itself, and a church that is more merciful, that is, rather than focusing on what he describes as rules that make us harsh judges, he wants a church that is more compassionate and more tolerant. Now, as you've said, I mean, he has indicated that not everything is up for grabs on issues such as women, priests, and abortion. He has said that Catholic teaching is not going to change. But he has indicated remarkable willingness to change on a variety of other fronts, including a decentralization of papal authority towards a kind of democratization of the church, empowerment of the laity, a more generous line on admission to the sacraments of the Catholic Church, especially communion, which could have implications not just for divorced and remarried Catholics, and there are millions of them around the world, but also pro-choice Catholic politicians in places such as the States, where some bishops have publicly threatened to turn them away in the communion line. So on a variety of fronts, Becky, this is a remarkable, I would say almost sweeping manifesto for change. It's a fairly dramatic news day in the Vatican beat.
And let's remind ourselves, lest we forget, that the world Catholic population is more than 1 billion, making up half of the world's Christian population. So this becomes an important story. Let's take a look, John, at one of the key quotes from the document. Pope Francis says, and I quote, "I prefer a church which is bruised, hurting and dirty, because it's been out on the streets, rather than a church which is unhealthy from being confined and from clinging to its own security." Your thoughts?
Well, that's a section of the document where Francis is actually quoting a line that he repeated over and over again when he was the Archbishop of Buenos Aires in Argentina, which boils down to that he wants the church to be out on the streets. He said repeatedly that a church that spends too much time in the sacristy, that is, inside its own space, breathing the same stale air, gets sick. And, you know, that can sound like rhetoric, Becky, but after Francis was elected, I went down to Buenos Aires and spent a month there reporting on the backstory of who Jorge Mario Bergoglio was. And one of the things you discover is that as an archbishop, as a churchman, this is not a guy who spent a lot of time behind a desk. He went out into what the Argentines call the vicious miserias, the villas of miseries, that is, the slums that surround Buenos Aires, spent most of his time interacting with ordinary people and listening to their stories over and over again. I would meet people who would say, poor people, ordinary people, who would say that Bergoglio had been with them when they lost a child, or had baptized their kids, or had sat in their living room when their husband died, that's where he felt the church came alive. And I think that's the spirit that permeates the document that we saw from him today.
Let's try another one then. In reference to some traditional practices, he says, and I quote, "Some of these customs may be beautiful, but they no longer serve as means of communicating the gospel. We should not be afraid to re-examine them. At the same time, the church has rules or precepts which may have been quite effective in their time, but no longer have the same usefulness for directing and shaping people's lives." John, what does he mean by that, and what should we expect going forward?
Well, I think fundamentally he is calling for Catholics to shift away from a kind of fussy obsession with the fine points of certain aspects of church life. For example, the fine points of how you worship in the church, what we call liturgy, you know, exactly what vestments the priest ought to wear, precisely how certain gestures ought to be executed. I mean, as important as those things once were for creating culture in the church, I think he's saying that we have to keep our eyes on the prize, the big picture. And as he sees it, The big picture is a church that is relevant to ordinary people in the early 21st century, which in a particular way, as you indicated at the top of this segment, means a church that is concerned with the poor. I think it's striking that the strongest language of this document, called The Joy of the Gospel, has to do with critiquing what he calls a kind of crude and naive faith in the free market, and insisting that the church has to be a change agent on things like income inequality, spreading unemployment, the environment, war and peace.
All right.
That those are the issues that make a critical difference in the lives of people, and that's where he wants the church to be.